Hi, thanks for tuning in to What's Alien Here in America. I'm Frank Craven, and today I'm very honored to be with my friend Cliff Carpenter. Hi, Cliff.
Hi.
So, Cliff, tell me, how old are you, incidentally?
87.
Hey, Cliff knew my grandpa and my dad. He saw them in our town, and plus my dad and him went to high school together in Beverly Hills High School. So Cliff lived through a very dark period of American politics and American theater, movies and television. You were a founding member of AFTRA, right? American.
Well, you might say that. I have a card number 25 from Los Angeles, and which I acquired, I guess, in 1937.
So you were like one of the original members of the American Federation of Radio Artists, huh?
Yeah, I think yes, that's so. Yeah.
And you made a living over not only as an actor on stage, but also in radio, right?
Yeah, well, for some time, exclusively on radio, did I make a living, and I went into that to make a living because I saw no other avenue to make a living. I'm talking about starting in the Depression, 1936, when. I graduated from UCLA in 1936, and I couldn't get a job doing anything because...
Well, those were dark years for a lot of people.
Oh, they were for the whole country. But what few jobs there were people who were much better qualified than I for even pumping gas. You could have a graduate engineer to pump gas for Union Oil or
1936 you're talking about?
Yeah.
Wasn't that the year of the Berlin Olympics and
yes.
Precursor to the World War II?
That's right, yeah. Anyway, excuse me, I couldn't get a job. There was an ad in the paper they wanted people to dig an aqueduct in the Mojave, I guess, in the desert. And that's such intimidating work that they even put an ad in the middle of the Depression, put an ad in the paper. Well, I saw that, I said, God damn it, I'll go. So I went and I applied, along with many other people, of course, for this job. And the guy, the interviewer, he looked down my application. He said, you're a college graduate. I said, yeah. He said, no, we don't want you. You'd quit. You wouldn't stay with it. I said, I need the work. He said, get lost,
That reminds me of what my dad said when he was in the Army. They said, how many PhDs are there? A few raised their hands and says, okay, you're post-hole diggers. He ran a USO in the Naples. Yeah, but anyway, let's get on to the story. I want to know about the blacklisting. What do you know about that? What involvement did you have in the actual Hollywood blacklisting during the McCarthy era and all that?
Actually, when the blacklisting hit, of course, it was after World War II, and I was living in New York. But many of my friends went to jail, not only to federal penitentiaries, but to state prisons, too, because they had these little un-American activities committees in the states, because that's a way a politician could get a little coverage, you see.
But I thought they, in the ballot, Communist Party, you were land of the free, home of the brave. America, you can be an affiliate of any political party. So why would they go to jail if they were affiliated with Socialist or Communist Party?
Because the government decided that they wanted to create an atmosphere in this country, and the atmosphere was, where they embarked upon the Cold War era, which meant to do everything they could to prevent the spread of socialism, to contain it. That's what they called it, and to eliminate any opposition to this Cold War policy. And of course, people who believed in scientific socialism or unscientific socialism would be opposed to that policy, and they wanted to convince the American people, don't fool with us, we're serious.
Yeah.
And so they executed the Rosenbergs on the grounds that they had provided information about nuclear fission or nuclear bomb to the Soviet Union.
But of course, the FBI stooge Hansen or CIA stooge Aldrich Ainge that really sold out our country are sitting having fun jerking off in jail. But they're executing people who smoke pot or take coke nowadays, and you know, it's a mess. We have prison slave labor in our current prison system. But I'm not worried about today because it's a big mess. I'm worried about what happened in our history. About 50 years ago, you said 1937 it started? No, we're looking at McCarthyism was in the 50s.
That's right. It really started after World War II, because that's when the Cold War began. And as I say, the principal intention of that whole blacklist era was to intimidate people, and they executed the Rosenbergs. Now they charged Rosenbergs with having provided information about a nuclear bomb to the Soviet Union. But at the time that they were charged with having done this, the Soviet Union was an ally of the United States, and actually not only an ally, but carrying the major burden of the war against Hitler and Mussolini and Tojo. So, you know, how could that be treason? I mean, you could say, well, you know, you're not supposed to give away these secrets, but you gave away this, if you did it, you gave the secrets to a wartime ally. Therefore, you should be executed. What's the name of the Ezra Pound? Ezra Pound was an open and avowed anti-Semite and supporter and enthusiast for Mussolini.
Well, wait a second. Speaking of anti-Semites, we know that Allen Dulles, head of the CIA, fired by JFK, was also one of the lawyers that brokered the deals with Prescott Bush, whose grandpa, great-grandpa Bush's, you know, for Nazis. They were totally Nazi sympathetic, and there was a major anti-Semitism in this country at that time. That's why Hitler got away with murder the way he did for so long, right?
I think that's true, yeah. Anyway, to pick up the thread, oh, Ezra Pound, yeah. Ezra Pound actually broadcast, I think, for Mussolini. And when the war, at the end of the war, he was taken as a prisoner, really, of the American forces and brought back to this country. And it was a hot potato because he's a very highly thought of poet, and I think justifiably so. Although there was a lot of his writing was so arcane, I think many people didn't know what it was about. But in any event, he was highly thought of. Well, what they did was that this guy who was who worked for Mussolini was put in a mental hospital for a while, and while he was there, he was given one of the highest awards for poetry, the Bollinger Award, and then he was released. But in the case of the Rosenbergs, they executed them. They executed them, and they were well.
Anyway, okay, that's another travesty of justice, and then debatable. Like Sacco and Vanzetti, original anarchists, that for their political affiliation were killed and executed. But anyway, what about what do you know, or what do you experience or remember about the actual McCarthy era blacklisting? When did that begin, and what evolved there?
Well, it began, McCarthy latched on to this sensational idea that the government is riddled with communists. And I have a list here. I'm not going to divulge the names, but I have a list here of 250 people in the State Department, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And people say, oh, really? Gee whiz. You know, I've always suspected those New Dealers, et cetera, et cetera. Well, he got a hell of a lot of mileage out of that. And not only that, he got some support from surprising people. I think the Kennedys supported him at that time, initially.
Well, basically everyone was sort of behind him initially, but then he had sort of unraveled at the seams, and they saw how hysterical and ridiculous he was. And I remember old Dean Carlton was telling me stories, and his friend Ring Lardner was blacklisted, and a few prominent playwrights and American actors had to leave the country. Noble, good. Even if they were communist affiliates and people that were in the Lincoln Brigades who fought against Franco and fascism during the Spanish Civil War, we're vilified in this country for being somehow anti-American, which is ridiculous. So, what was your involvement? Were you blacklisted?
Yes.
And
I ensured myself the honor of being blacklisted by leading the charge in the Union against blacklisting.
oh, good.
And when I say leading, that sounds immodest, but it happens to be accurate. There was at that time, before AFTRA came into existence, when there was AFTRA, American Federation of Radio Artists, which became, as we all know, American Federation of Radio and Television Artists. Anyway...
well, basically, let me just interject. I've stood up at the AFTRA meetings in SAG trying to initiate policy against El Salvador and whatnot, like Ed Asner did in the 80s, and I was voted down or told, no, that's political. We can't go there. And it's like, you know, I was thinking, excuse me, what do you mean you can't? You have to take a moral stand. Let's vote on this and have a consensus to say we don't go there. We're not supporting this, you know. We take a moral stand. So good for you. You actually was able to get the AFTRA behind you or not?
Well, at that time, between the existence of AFTRA and the creation of AFTRA, there was a holding organization called Television Authority, and it was actually the union which became AFTRA. Anyway, there was a membership meeting with, you know, very substantially attended, and I proposed a resolution to investigate blacklist and gather information from people who were or believe themselves to be blacklisted, and to present this to the board, and for the union to take a position that blacklisting is an unfair labor practice. Well, I proposed this resolution, and it was overwhelmingly endorsed, and it provided for the creation of this committee. And because it was my resolution, I was elected to that committee, and
you were the chairperson.
I was the chairperson of that committee. Now,
what was it called exactly?
Anti-blacklist.
Anti-blacklist. What year was this? More or less?
More or less. Gee whiz. More or less. I would guess around 1950, I guess. I could look it up. Yeah, that's the old saying. You could look it up, you know. And it was precipitated. There was a very dedicated unionist and a very fine character actor named Phil Loeb, who had been active in particularly in equity for years, and he was highly respected, and many people felt a great deal of affection for him, and he had been very active politically. I don't think he was ever a communist, but that's neither here nor there. But he had a son who was institutionalized, and it cost him a lot of money. At that time, he was playing the father in the Goldbergs, which was originally a radio program, and then it was a television program, and so on. So Mrs. Berg, who controlled it and was Mrs. Goldberg of the Goldbergs, and who wrote it and started and so on, the sponsor wanted to get rid of Phil Loeb because he was marked lousy.
Because of the blacklisting.
Because of his political, because of blacklisting. So Mrs. Berg arranged for him to take a payoff, you might say, from. Are you picking me up? A payoff from the a payment from the sponsor to leave the program. So when I got up to make my little pitch, you see, I said, actors like Phil Loeb should not be paid not to work. And Phil was elected to be on this committee. Well, we got a number of people to come and testify to our committee. But it was touchy, you see, because if you made if you expose them, these people who were persuaded they were blacklisted, if you expose them to the public, or even to the industry, that might solidify their blacklist. So there was that dilemma. However, we finally went to the board of AFTRA, which was dominated at that time by a group called the Artists Committee. And the Artists Committee, in fact, although they denied it, they in fact they supported blacklist. And they were the dominant political force at that moment in the union. So we got producers to come in and testify to the board that yes, there was a blacklist, and there were many names on it. But they tried not to give any names for the obvious reasons. But they testified that yes, there is a goddamn blacklist, and it involves a lot of actors. Well, that put the board, you see, on the spot, and they had contended that at the next negotiations, that having blacklisting declared an unfair labor practice would be at the top of the agenda. So they were on a spot. Well, then we went into the union went into negotiations with management, and they finally, George Heller, who was at that time the executive secretary, I guess, of AFTRA, and had been one of the initiators of AFTRA, and had really done a wonderful job to create the union. But through the years and the pressures of the time and so on, he accommodated himself to the group that had captured control of the union, namely the self-styled Artist Committee.
Which, incidentally, is an ongoing practice, it seems, throughout the history of all unions, that they're sellout to producers, and, they cater to the money, and they don't really pay attention to what the consensus of the membership's needs are. They should have been vociferously adamant against blacklisting, period, because that is what the majority wanted. Unfortunately, as usual, the mucky-mucks on top of the union were like kowtowing to the producers, as they do today, I'm afraid.
Yeah, there's also another sad reality, I think, and that is that there were actors who voted for the Artists Committee who secretly thought the more of these guys get blacklisted, the more opportunities for jobs there be for me. Yeah, that's so sad, isn't it? But I'm afraid that was one of the considerations. Also, people didn't want to publicly take a progressive position anywhere because the smear could rub off on you. Oh.
God forbid we should be progressive and think in radical terms. Radical problems need radical solutions, and if you got something serious, stand up and be heard. Don't be afraid. I believe don't be afraid. What do you? Do you like being afraid? No, obviously not.
No, I'm not keen about being afraid. Not at all. Never have been. As a matter of fact, basically, I'm really a retiring and timid and frightened person.
Yeah, but you like to stand up for justice.
Well, yes, that's true. Yeah.
So on to the story. Now tell me some more gory, juicy details as you recall about that dark period of history when not only the Performers Union, but all of America was taken a storm by McCarthyism, and suddenly, there was a communist in every closet.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because the ramifications of this whole blacklisting thing went into all industries, right? They were able to vilify anybody they felt that they want to bounce out of any company.
It's what is known as national intimidation.
Mass hysteria, like with Hitler's Sieg Heil. Everyone suddenly got on the same page.
Yeah. Well, so some of the consequences were that Phil Loeb was staying with Zero Mostel and his family, and he left Zero's apartment, went to the Taft Hotel, and killed himself.
Oh, God bless him. He couldn't take the heat, huh?
Well, it wasn't. I think it wasn't the heat that he couldn't take. This is just my interpretation of that event. I think it was the guilt and shame he felt that he accommodated himself to these people. In other words, he permitted himself to be bought off. That's what it amounted to. And he was a person of, you know, of true principle and character. And I think that ate away at him. And finally he said, oh, the hell with it. And he killed himself.
How about other people on that committee of yours that were against blacklisting, or other famous figures in history that were subjugated to this horrendous practice?
Subjected to, this horrendous practice. Not subject. Well, okay.
Subjugated is wrong. Subjected.
No, never mind. You mentioned Ring Lardner. We didn't say Jr., but it was Ring Lardner Jr., who was a friend of mine, and he went. He spent a year in jail in Danbury, which was close to where his mother lived in New Milford.
Ring Lardner was a great playwright. He wrote The Lady of Larkspur Lotion.
The time came that George Heller stood in front of the membership and announced the terms of the new contract. He rattled them all off, and everybody felt quite happy about it. And then he said, so far as the blacklisting is concerned, this union will not go on record as supporting the right of communists to work. End of meeting, boom, out, you know. Well, in the first place, you know, it's a lie, because there were people being blacklisted who were not communists, for goodness sakes. People who had some social concern and dignity and refused to be intimidated, and they had signed petitions. And they don't call it a federal penitentiary, they call it
correctional facility. Without any correction, there's not much rehabilitation going on. It's prison slave labor we got nowadays, folks. Meanwhile, Europe is enjoying decriminalization of drugs and enjoying reality. In this country, we live in a place that's called a disguised dictatorship, where there's 3 strikes, you're out, like Latin American dictatorships. And the penal code reform that is necessary is amazing, because we have real prison slave labor going on. And it's very sick. We need to have a total readjustment of our current political scenario. Wouldn't you agree, Cliff?
Yeah, I'm not sure that I would characterize the present situation in quite the terms that you do, but certainly there's a lot to make us sad and apprehensive in the present situation. But to get back to Ring Lardner in the correctional institution in Danbury, while he was there, a well-known figure joined him there, and the well-known figure was a man named Parnell Thomas, who was a congressman from New Jersey, and they had caught him with his hand in the cookie jar in a very serious way, and they...
Oh my God, a senator who caught with him taking money? That's not done.
Anyway, so he ended up in the same Danbury institution as Ring, and Parnell Thomas had been ahead of the House Committee on Un-American Activities. God knows if there was anyone who was truly a patriot, it was the committee head of a committee that was against un-Americanism. He ended up in the prison there. Anyway, a fellow prisoner with Ring. Well, you know, I thought of what would it be like for somebody like Ring, who was an intellectual, you know, Princeton man. Anyway, what would it be like for him to be in with some rather powerful and violent figures who might have done some naughty things? And what would it be like to be in a prison with? Well, I was surprised when he told me. He said, they kind of figured that anybody who is in the prison must be a good person. Otherwise, he wouldn't be there, you see. Oh, you were against the government? You're one of us, kid, you know. He sort of gave me that idea. And they, of course, they gave him a job there, I think, working in the library or doing things like that, clerical things. And but he was a very, by nature, a sort of reticent person, and soft-spoken and wonderfully thoughtful. That was just his nature. But he had what I think Richard Nixon called cojones. And he had cojones in a big way. Anyway,
Well, Richard Nixon minced no words when it came to cursing. He was well known for turning that White House into a puta parlor. Those White House tapes are scandalous. They're all deleted, of course, because no one can stomach the way his vulgarity.
yeah. Well, no, I wanted to say something else about Ring. When he came out of prison, as I say, his mother had a home in New Milford, and by some coincidence, we had a second home in New Milford, quite close to his mother's home, and my wife and I had bought this property with the Wanamaker, Sam and Charlotte Wanamaker. And there were 2 houses and 22 acres, and we bought it together. And so we saw Ring and his wife, Frances Cheney, who was an actress with whom I had worked in radio. I played Terry on Terry and the Pirates, and she was one of the she played Burma, which was a running character to me. So we had those connections. Also, by some ridiculous coincidence, they moved out of an apartment at 400 East 59th, and we rented that apartment and didn't know it had been their apartment until at a rehearsal for Terry, I said, well, we just took this apartment at 400 East 59th Street, and she said, what apartment is that? I said, 12G or whatever it was, and she said, that's the apartment we just left. People who had some social concern and dignity and refused to be intimidated, and they had signed petitions and attended meetings, but they sure as hell weren't communists. And he knew that, but he'd let them go down the drain with all of us hideous subversives who cherished a dream of scientific socialism, a war a world without war, a world with peace, a world where production would be only for use and not for profit, where there could be universal disarmament, and where everyone would have assurance of medical attention. And, you know, the communists in the United States were the first people that I know of who said blacks should be able to play in Major League Baseball. And I said, oh, wait a minute, back off. And there were some people who were hideously disturbed at the thought that black people would be able to play in the same team with people like Babe Ruth. But the communists said, God damn it, they're citizens, you know, they have a right to play ball, and they should be, why are they discriminated against? Thank goodness, not thank goodness, but the major leagues are more or less dominated by well, substantially infiltrated, whatever, with people of color. Well, in spite of their promises and representations, when the time came that George Heller stood in front of the membership and announced the terms of the new contract, he rattled them all off, and everybody felt quite happy about it. And then he said, so far as the blacklisting is concerned, this union will not go on record as support